Let's look at how we can refactor our application to eliminate this repetition. Looking at repeated execution patterns in our application, we immediately see that the main method is doing the same thing over and over again, where it initially writes out a log message, calls some method, and then writes out another log message. This is repeated 3 times in our main method, and if we had this program continuing to grow, we can imagine that as we added additional methods that it might call, it would continue to grow, and we would have a lot of repetition in how this pattern is followed. The first step in refactoring this would be to extract out this method. So we can use the extract method refactoring and generate a method that we'll just call command for now. And so in our command, we're going to write out our write line, then call the extract command, and then finally write out the next write line. So the next step is to change this so that instead of being this particular command, we'll call this something else. For instance, we could say this could be step in process. And then the actual command that it's going to follow is a particular action. So we'll pass that in now, since we want to be able to vary this particular line while keeping these other lines more or less the same. So in this case, we'll just call action. And then here we would have to pass in our extract command. And that will allow us to do pretty much the same thing we were doing before. And we can test this using our manual testing process. And we see that the application continues to run as it did before. At this point, the next step would be to add support for these next 2 lines that are repeated as well. And so in order to do that, we'll simply duplicate this call to step in process and pass in the other method names, transform and load. With that, we've eliminated the repetition of how the logging is done, except that now we're seeing that the extract here needs to change as well. So we can change this by simply putting in a variable in this case. And for that variable, we'll use the actions methods name instead. And in this case, we're going to get a slightly different formatted result, but that's okay because this is just logging. We'll save this and run it. And you can see that it still runs as it has before. And here we can see it finished extract, finished transform, beginning load. You can see the those messages are still being output. So now we have a little bit of repetition here in that we see that we're calling this step in process, that step in process, the next step in process. It would probably be better if we could refactor that as well, just so that if we did get a much larger application where we were having to orchestrate a whole lot of different steps in a particular workflow, we could do that in a more maintainable fashion. The easiest way to do that is to take those steps and apply a loop to them. So we're simply moving this out of the main section and saying something like for each, let's call this get steps, and we'll say this is a step. Then we'll just say step in process step, right? And at that point, I don't really like the name step in process. Let's call this execute step. And then we need get steps to be created for us. So we'll create this method get steps, and it'll return an IEnumerable action, which is correct. And here we can just say that we want to yield return extract. And then we'll do yield return transform and yield return load. So with that, we'll be doing the exact same thing as we had before, but now we've moved this data, or rather this logic, from our main method and put it into this get steps method that we could push into a different application assembly if we wanted to. And it's making it so that our main method doesn't have the responsibility of determining which steps or what order the steps are done in. That's now the responsibility of this method here. Let's show that that still works. And it does. You can see we're still finish transform, beginning load, finish load. as before. Now this yield keyword, if you're not familiar with it, it's a C# keyword that allows this particular method to yield its result back to the calling method. And then as the for each enumerates through this method, it'll continue to call into this. So it'll first call this one, and then it will call this one, and then it will call this one. Now, if that syntax is strange to you, another option would be to simply do something like this: return new list of action, where we're going to say that this is contains extract transform load. And since list is an enumerable, we could do this as well. And this would run as well. So it's just a matter of your preference whether you want to create a list to return or simply use this yield syntax. Yield syntax is a little bit smaller, so I'm going to go with that. But it really would make no difference to the application.